mercifully killed at the, can we do that? Killed at the hands of the individuals in law enforcement in our state and our country. As I said last night, we have and we will continue to stand with all those who have and continue to demand justice, equity, and accountability for black lives in our country. Lives like those of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony Robinson, Dontre Hamilton, Ernest Lacy, Tyrese West, and Sybil Smith. We also stand against excessive use of force and immediate escalation when engaging with black Wisconsinites. I've said all along, we must offer our empathy. We must see the trauma, fear, and exhaustion of being black in our state and our country. But equally important to our empathy is our action. As family members, as friends, as neighbors, as people, the duty to act rests on all of us, and perhaps most importantly, on us as elected officials. More than 2 months ago now, Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes and I announced a package of legislation to increase accountability and transparency in policing in Wisconsin. This package invests in community violence interruption program and works to address the issue of inappropriate use of force by individuals in law enforcement, prohibit dangerous police practices, build upon the work of the Law Enforcement Standards Board, and strengthens accountability measures. These are common sense policies that transcend political debate, and many of them have been embraced by community, state, and federal leaders on both sides of the aisle, including our neighbors in both Iowa and Minnesota, who have passed similar comprehensive, meaningful reform. Yet 2 months later, and with Wisconsin's legislative leaders have failed to act. This movement has touched every corner of Wisconsin, and frankly, I should not need to call a special session when people across our state, from streets from my small hometown of Plymouth to the streets of Milwaukee, are demanding their elected leaders take action. Leaders show up. Leaders do the work that needs to be done and that the people demand of them. But we cannot wait for Republican leadership to show up for work, because clearly they intend to keep us waiting. That's not going to cut it. Not for me, not for Lieutenant Governor Barnes, and certainly not the people of the state who are leading at this time and in this moment. That's why today I'm calling for a special session of the legislature to take up the package of legislation we announced earlier this year. We must begin the long but important path towards ensuring our state and our country starts to live up to our promises of equity and justice. I want to be clear, this is not the time for politics. I'm urging Republican leadership to rise to this important moment in history, to put people before politics and to put lives of black Wisconsinites above politics, and to give this special session the urgent and productive effort this moment demands and that the people of Wisconsin deserve. We must rise to this movement and this moment and meet it with our empathy, our humanity, and a fierce commitment to disrupt the cycle of systemic racism and bias that devastates black families and communities, to see the daily trauma, fear, and exhaustion black Wisconsinites face, and to show up day after day to do the work that needs to be done. I know folks across our state will be making their voices heard in communities across Wisconsin. Every person should be able to make their voices heard and report on these calls to action without any fear of being unsafe. If you're exercising that right today and in the days ahead, please do so peacefully, and please wear your mask and keep social distance as best you can. We know racism and the racial disparities in our state can't be solved by any single bill or package of bills. This can only be the first step. As our state reels from another attack on a black man at the hands of law enforcement, as communities grieve and exercise their First Amendment rights to demand justice, and as Jacob Blake fights for his life, we are all reminded that racism is a public health crisis. There is no time to waste. Thank you so much. And now I'll turn things over to Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes.
All right, thank you so much, Governor Evers, for taking the moment. Thank you for your sincerity that's much needed at a moment like this. Last night, as you stated, Jacob Blake was shot in the back 7 times in front of his children. And let me be clear, this was not an accident. This wasn't bad police work. This felt like some sort of vendetta being taken out on a member of our community. The officer's deadly actions attempted to take a person's life in broad daylight. And like many of you, the video is etched into my mind, like so many other past videos that are just like it. It was a video that I would have rather not had watched. But the irony isn't lost on me that as Jacob Blake was actually trying to de-escalate a situation in his community, but the responding officer didn't feel the need to do the same. And now we all know Jacob Blake's name. And as I've said before, as we've all said before, this is familiar violence to too many of us, especially of those of us who are on the receiving end, whose communities have been over-policed, whose children learn early on that police officers aren't always serving and protecting them as they should. This didn't start with George Floyd, unfortunately. It's been around far longer than him, and if we don't do anything, this will continue as we saw yesterday. I would hate to see this not end with Jacob Blake. And that's why we have to respond. And we know that we can't remedy the white supremacy and the systemic racism that is built into all of our systems in just a couple years or with any package of legislation. But that doesn't mean we don't act. That doesn't mean that we stand still. We have to do everything that we can do within our power to first call out the systemic violence that happens every day in this state and in this country, and then do the work to rebuild those systems that perpetuate it, Not just when a black man is murdered in front of his children, but when schools that serve the same children are systemically underfunded, or when we see black women have to fight to be heard in our healthcare system, or when black communities are expected to live in more polluted communities, dealing with environmental hazards and toxins and contaminants. These too are forms of systemic violence. And the social and economic consequences of these deep-seated inequities, they reach every community across Wisconsin. That's why leaders at every level of government have an obligation to hear the demands for justice for those who are marching in the streets. You think after the past few months of people who are stepping up to demand justice that police departments, chiefs of police, even police unions will rush to implement some sort of reform. But that hasn't happened, or else you wouldn't have seen the actions that we all had to see last night. People's pain, anger, and frustration is a long overdue call to action. In June, the governor and I called on the legislature to bring some level of accountability and transparency into law enforcement. And we knew that this legislation would only be a first step towards justice, but that doing nothing is not an option. Unfortunately, our legislative leaders, the majority party, the Republicans in the legislature, although this is not political, these are facts, they have done nothing. And this is unfortunately what we as Wisconsinites, not we as the executive branch, not we as the Governor Evers administration, we as Wisconsinites have come to expect nothing anytime that we find ourselves in a time of crisis. The people of our state are done waiting for their leaders and their elected officials to show up. And so are we. And as the governor said, true leaders, they do the work that has to be done. True leaders do the work that people demand of them, especially when it's hard. So I sincerely hope for the people all across Wisconsin that we see some leadership from our legislature in the coming days. As I said before, doing nothing is not an option. This is not something that you can just sit on your hands or bury your head in the sand in. To everybody that is as tired as I am, know that I stand with you in this fight for a better world, a world where black lives actually matter, a world with decency, a world with true justice, a world full of equity and opportunity for all people, for black people who have been dealt a bad hand far too many times. And remember that these things are always worth fighting for. So I want to remind people to please take care of yourselves. Please stay safe. Join me in praying for Jacob Blake and his family, and join me in fighting to make sure that this does not ever happen again. Thank you so much.